first off, what'd you guys think of the documentaries? Did we hopefully learned a whole lot? Uh, yeah, kind of interesting history that begins the field of computer science as we know it. And so that documentary is part of the machine that changed the world. It's a five-parter. The third, fourth, and fifth parts talk about some more recent stuff. It was produced in the early 90s by, I think it was WGBH, which is one of the um, like public access, or not public access, but like PBS stations in the Boston area. Um, and so the videography is a bit, dated, certainly. It, you know, that's videos like that is what I remember all from my childhood. It'd be kind of neat if they would remake it for the modern era and update stuff because, of course, a lot has happened since the early 90s in terms of technology. But oh well. And it's really hard to find, actually. So some libraries have it. I was able to get it on interlibrary loan last year, VHS. Right. So there's not even DVDs of it. So getting it, yeah. So anyway, so somebody uploaded some of those parts to Vimeo, and I think the only reason it hasn't gotten copyright striked is, it's relatively old and probably 400 people aren't, watching it every minute. So it's sort of flown under the radar. Okay. So what we'll sort of talk about today. So the last week, right? I mean, Friday, we did sort of the big picture, what's actually on the inside of a computer. And your laptops are basically the same in the sense of everything that's inside compared to a desktop, except it's just a whole lot smaller, right? And miniaturized. Um, and uh, and then also, unlike a desktop, your laptop has to have a battery built in for obvious reasons, and a keyboard built in, and the screen built in, and all of those sorts of things. So, same principle. It's just hyper miniaturized compared to a desktop, which is one reason why, if you want sort of a gaming laptop is maybe a misnomer because they'll be like this thick and right, take a giant power brick and whatnot. Because if you miniaturize something to the point of, an iPad or a laptop, then you start running into thermal issues quite quickly. So, for example, the processors that are in most laptops, I think at most will put out maybe 30-ish watts of heat. You tend to put really low thermal processors in there compared to desktop ones, which easily, can put out 1 to 200 watts depending on which kind you've got. Um, so anyway, so in the intro that we did on Friday and in the documentaries, right? So what fundamental devices build computers or have and can? So there's several of them. Okay, yeah, Ethan. Okay, switches of what sort? Let's elaborate a little bit. Okay, so vacuum tubes is one. Okay, and there's two others that have been used. Yes, I'm sorry. They're not the switches. That's how you program it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So Conrad Zuse used telephone relays. Okay, which were sort of mechanical, like spring-loaded type things, and then the transistor. Okay, so uh, Zuse originally used telephone relays because, well, they were a relatively simple technology. He had crap tons of them available, and so he built his first, the Z1, out of using telephone relays. He wanted to build something with vacuum tubes, but Hitler, being Hitler, said no. And then on this side of the pond, right, ENIAC and other machines were using the vacuum tubes. Okay, so flash forward to the transistor a little bit, which instead of something being the size of a light bulb, you've got something that's the size of this, right? So, and for those of you who are at home, let me switch over to the webcam and show you. Okay, so here's my finger, and there's the transistor, right? So really, really tiny, tiny gadget. Uh, this is a single transistor, and we'll talk about how this thing actually works, some of which is magic and some of which is physics, basically. All magic is physics. Um, there's somebody who said, I forget who it was, but it's basically like any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, right? So if I were to like hand this to a caveman, this might as well literally be magic. So anyway, all right. So yeah, this is a single transistor. Um, and what's in your computer processors are those, but even more ridiculously miniaturized than what you see there, right? So uh, the to the point where a computer processor, the chip, you're talking packing billions of these things onto, something that's the size of your fingernail, if that. Okay, so really, 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 really tiny integrated circuits, and that like if we were still using transistors like that for to build an entire computer, then instead of it being the whole room with the ENIAC, it might be the whole table kind of thing with these guys, right? You could do it, but um, it would be real, still power hungry and also kind of bulky. So the integrated circuits, what's allowed this to shrink considerably. But so what I want to talk about now is uh, sort of what a transistor does, how it functions. We'll talk about some of the different kinds of them, and we'll talk maybe more about the integrated circuit kind of way those are constructed later. But yeah, so we'll start with this guy, which is uh, a NPN, and we'll talk about what those letters mean. Um, Transistor, okay, and it's a bijunction transistor. So bijunction transistor. Okay, so let's talk some chemistry for a little bit. What are these things made out of? What are most semiconductors made out of? Like, huh? Silicon, right? Hence Silicon Valley. Okay, so made of silicon. All right, and silicon, wait a minute, this is weird. I was going to say, for the one time I need a periodic table in the room, it's not here. Great. Okay, so where is silicon on the periodic table? Huh? The right? All right. Yeah, well, let's just pull up a periodic table, how shall we? So let's see. We want a periodic table. Okay, good old Wikipedia. All right, so here we go. There's our periodic table, and silicon is number 14, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So what chemical properties does it have? Well, in particular, like carbon, which is just above it, or germanium, which is just below it, um, it what period is it, or sorry, group is it in our family? Okay, so it's in this one, and what does that tell me about its sort of electron structure? Where are my chem guys? Come on. 6? 4, okay? So the guys over on the far right have a full valence of 8, so 7, 6, 5, 4, okay? In the outer shell. Okay, so so silicon has uh, 4 valence electrons. Okay, and so what silicon would like to do is have 8, right? Atoms want to have a full valence shell if they can. but you can't just create electrons out of nothing. So what are silicon atoms going to do? They're going to buddy up with neighboring silicon atoms and share electrons. Okay, and so they form a crystal or a lattice structure where each, well, let me draw a few more of them so that it's, so that, like, say this guy in the middle, right? He has 4 valence electrons of his own, and surrounding him are 4 other silicon atoms. And if he shares one with each one of them, then he's got 8. And if this continues sort of in a lattice structure, then everybody's got basically 8, right? So they're sharing the things with covalent bonds. Yeah, this reminds me, by the way, of one of my favorite chemistry jokes from middle school. So, what did super secret agent water molecule H2O when asked? What did he say when he was asked about his secret identity? He said, "My name is Bond, covalent bond." No, too early. All right. Anyway, okay. So right. So these things are going to form a lattice structure. Now, silicon or semiconductors, they're not just silicon, okay? They're silicon that's been what we call doped, meaning that we're going to deliberately introduce impurities in it in order to change the electrical properties of it. And we can dope it with a couple of things. So let's go back to the periodic table. All right, and so what we want to do is we want to look to the left and to the right. Okay, so if we were to throw in every now and then an atom of, say, phosphorus or arsenic, okay, which are these guys here, right? They have 5 valence electrons. So if we throw them into the mix every now and then what effectively do we have every now and then? So you got the 4 valence electrons, but then there's an extra one, right? And so on the whole, what you've created is something that's negatively charged, okay? And so we call that an N-type, for negative, uh, semiconductor. Okay, now on the other hand, if we use something from this family, which has 3 valence electrons, then we'd be sort of 1 short on electrons sort of every now and then. Okay, and so on the whole, that thing's going to be a P positively charged or P type. Okay, so the magic for this comes not by making either one individually, but what happens when you put them next to each other, which, you know, like I said, we could spend an entire semester talking about semiconductor physics, but that'll be good enough for now. So, so the stuff that you can use for the N-type, you can use phosphorus, arsenic, or antimony. And I mean, I suppose theoretically you could use bismuth or whatever MC, you know, but that's super radioactive, I'm sure, so we wouldn't want to use that. Uh, or even theoretically nitrogen, but of course there's one minor problem, right? Nitrogen is gaseous, and uh, so getting it in there would be a little tricky. Or on the P type, then you could use, you know, boron, aluminum, or germanium are the ones that are used. Now that's kind of good because aluminum is pretty easy to come by, right, nowadays. It used to be super expensive. So I think it was Napoleon, he had aluminum plates and stuff because at the time that was like way more expensive than gold and platinum and whatnot. Um, and then on the sorry, group 15 side, right, phosphorus, that's pretty common, um, you know, and silicon is super easy to find, right? Just go to any beach, right? It's just littered with the stuff. So that's sort of handy that that a lot of the elements that you need to do this are relatively easily acquired on Earth. Okay, so we introduce impurities. Okay, so the N type, you would have, um, so let's say we used phosphorus, right? So you had silicon, but every now and then you've got a phosphorus, and so there's an extra electron hanging around, and so hence the whole thing is sort of negatively charged, okay? And then the P type, let's say we use aluminum. Um, there's a hole, right, where it's one short. Okay, so I can think of that hole as being like the absence of an electron, or I can sort of think of it, it's like a spot that an electron would want to go if it could. Um, okay, so you take these things, and if you put them together like so, so we talked about this transistor that I held up was an NPN. What that means is that if you look at it, I'll draw sort of a cross section. You have an N region, a P region, and an N region. And then I'm going to connect wires to each of the three regions. And I'll label them C, E, and B for base, collector, and emitter. It's just the terms we use for it. Okay, and I'll post a video. Well, I'm going to post a bunch of videos to the Canvas page that talks a little bit more about sort of the physics as to how this works. But essentially, what happens is if you apply a voltage, so you connect a battery or something to the collector and the emitter, right? So you're trying to build a circuit. The circuit will only turn on if you apply a current to the base. Okay, so the base, whether or not there's voltage being applied to it, determines whether or not the switch is on or off. Okay, in the same way with the telephone relay that Zeusa was using, it was pretty obvious when it was on or off, right? It's a literal switch, um, like a light switch or something. It's just got a spring and it's controlled with a magnet or something. Okay, but this thing is essentially a switch with no moving parts. Okay, now the vacuum tube didn't have any moving parts either, but what made the vacuum tube so inefficient? Yeah, they break, right? So you'd have to replace them just like a screw-in incandescent light bulb, although we don't really use those much anymore. Um, they got hot, right? They had to be warmed up to use, so they took a lot of energy. Whereas this thing, right, takes almost none. Now you start throwing billions of them together, and yeah, that energy is going to add up. But point being that they're extremely efficient and really tiny, right? So what I just schematically drew there is what's inside this, and the little black part that you see, right? That most of that is just plastic to contain the thing. The actual transistor itself is really small. It doesn't have to be gigantic to work. And like I said, the rest of it's just plastic to hold the thing together, and then have little metal leads so you can put it on a circuit board. Um, okay, so yeah, so that's basically how one of these things works, and um, the symbol for this item looks like this. Okay, so it's a circle with like a little arrow looking thing, and the arrow always points goes with the emitter side, and here's a nice way to remember which way the arrow should point. What kind of transistor are we talking about here? NPN. The arrow is not pointing in. NPN. Okay. Okay, Gucci? Now there is a second kind. Well, better late than never. Yeah. There is a second kind of these. Well, if I could sandwich a P in between two N's, I could also do it the other way and sandwich an N in between two P's. Okay, and that thing is called a, not shockingly, PNP transistor. All right, and its function is similar, but there's one minor change. Okay, so if I did this, okay, its symbol is similar to the other one, a circle, but this time the arrow is pointing in and it's on the other side, and what we call the collector and the emitter gets switched. Okay, so this one works slightly different. So let's just think about a switch, right, of some sort. Uh, is the switch default on or default off? Most of the time, yeah, right? We think of, okay, you want to turn the lights on in a room, you flip the switch to the on position. You want to turn it off, you turn it off. Okay, so imagine if, and this is where maybe the telephone relay is a more accurate example. Let's imagine that your light switch in your house had a spring in it, okay, so that if you turn it on, it stretches the spring and the spring is trying to pull the lever back down to the off position. Okay, so if you wanted to have the lights on, you'd have to sit there and hold the thing by continually pushing on it to counteract the action of the spring. NPN is like that. Okay, so where's the you pushing? That's where the base comes in. You put a small voltage across that, and that keeps the thing open on, or well, I guess closed is on in circuit language, but yeah, okay, so does that make sense? Now, what about if you put the spring the other way so that it always wants the light switch to be on and you have to push it down to get it into the off position, but if you let go, the spring pulls it back into the on position, right? I could do that too, just as easily. That's how a PNP works. So a PNP, if you apply voltage to the base, it turns off the switch rather than turning on the switch. That's more similar, by the way, to how vacuum tubes work, is that they were sort of default on rather than default off. Okay, okay, but most of the time, at least in most of the circuits I've built, I've used the NPN type rather than the PNP type. Okay, so yeah, so let's just recap, right? These are default off. And PNPs are default on. Okay, and notice that the arrow, it's pointing in. It is pointing in proudly. Yeah, so there's your little cheesy mnemonics to remember what's what. Okay, so let's actually wire up a simple circuit here that uses one of these things, and just to illustrate its function. So what I've got, and under normal circumstances, I would have you guys do this yourself, but thanks, coronavirus. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a little circuit board. Oops. This thing's called an Arduino. They're really cheap, like $5 for the board. They have a simple microprocessor on them, and that can't do tons of stuff. But then there's also all these little pins that you can plug lights, transistors in, and so you can program this thing to turn those pins off and on, and then therefore have sort of a programmable circuit. So for our purposes, I'm just going to use it uh, as something to give me some power, um, and something that I can plug wires into. All right, so let me plug yet another gadget into my computer here. This is starting to get a little ridiculous, but and then I'll try and use the webcam so you guys can see kind of what I'm up to. All right, so let me sort of switch over to the webcam, and that's this one. Okay, so I'm not sure how. Let's see if it can focus. There we go. All right, so I'm gonna take some of these parts off, but what do we have here? So I've got what's like this little green guy or the red guy. Those are LEDs. They're just lights. Okay. But most importantly, actually, about those, they are diodes. One of the videos I'm going to post talks about how a diode works. Um, and they're just diodes that emit light, um, which is useful. But we use diodes for plenty of other purposes. Diodes are essentially like one-way valves for electric flow. Current can go through one way, but not the other. That's um, under most circumstances. Okay, what about the little blue guys? Yeah, those are resistors. Okay, now this is a little hard to see, but you see how on each resistor there's a bunch of these little colored bands? Okay, so resistors come in various shapes, sizes, but what's important about them is what resistance they offer, hence the name. So a resistor basically constricts the flow of electricity. So it'd be kind of like putting a kink in your garden hose, right? It reduces the amount of water that flows through it, or current in the case of the electricity. And um, so if you use a really big resistor, it's only going to allow a really tiny current to go through, and vice versa. If you use a smaller resistor, then it'll allow more current to go through, and if you allow none, then you're essentially giving it whatever the board can deliver. Um, and I've got several different types up on there, and you select which one based on where it's going to be in the circuit, right? So if I want to power up a light, I'd use a relatively small resistor because I want to spend most of that energy powering up the light. Okay, so let me wire this thing up and let's see what we've got. All right, so now the bands I mentioned, there's a pattern to it, right? So I've got little cheat sheets, right? You can find these online, that where how you read the colored bands to figure out what the resistance is. And at first you're like, oh, this is crazy system. Eventually you kind of get used to it. Okay, so let me start with this little LED over here, and I'm going to put um, I'm going to use 3.3 volts, and then I'm going to, let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to wire this up real quick. So I'm going to go into here, then the resistor. And I'm not trying to be all pretty with my wiring here. It's sort of good enough for government work. Okay, and so if I did it correctly and didn't screw anything up, then, voila. Okay, so the circuit, the part that we're talking about is sort of on the far left here. I've got this red wire coming from positive 3.3 volts on the Arduino, okay, and that goes into the blue wire, which goes into the LED, which goes into the resistor, which goes into the green wire, which comes to the white wire, which goes to ground, and that completes my circuit. And the resistor that I've put there is a 330 ohm, so it's a relatively small one. And if I were to use, actually, I suppose I should have used a different color so that you guys can see it better. Let me switch over to the red one. Oops. Hang on. I need 4 hands to do this. There we go. Okay, so that maybe is a little easier to see against the white breadboard. So we've got the red LED and it's on. If I put a bigger resistor there, then the LED would shine, but less brightly. Okay, now on the subject of the LED, let me actually do something. So if you look on the LED, right, you see it's got two metal, tails coming out of it. What do you notice about them? Yeah, one's longer than the other. Okay, and that's not a mistake. That's deliberate. Uh, the longer one tells you which side is the positive side. Okay, and the shorter one, therefore, which side's the negative side. What happens if I plug it in backwards? Is it going to explode? Well, let's find out. Right. So if I plug it in backwards, what happens? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay, and the reason is because it's a diode, right? Diodes only allow current, under most circumstances, to go one direction, not the other. And if I plug it in backwards, no current's flowing, and so hence I don't get any light. So the long tail tells you which side's which so that you don't mess it up. Um, Although in the case of an LED, right, if it is supposed to be on and it isn't, then you messed it up. It's pretty obvious, right? It sort of tells you. Okay, so wonderful. So let me put this back the correct direction. And okay, so now as for the transistor, let me get some of this stuff out of the way here. All right, so what I'm going to do is rather than, so let me wire up another light, okay? And the wiring for this is going to be very similar to the other one. Uh, let's see, this should be a 330. Yeah. Okay, so this part I'm doing basically just what I did a minute ago. But instead of connecting it directly to the power, I'm going to use the transistor to control it. Okay, so um, the ground, I'll go ahead and ground it. Okay, and if I were to plug it into the positive voltage, like so, it would turn on. That was a loose connection in there. Oh, come on. Oh, that's why. And okay, why are you not powering? Oh, that would help. There we go. Okay, so if I were to wire it up like that, right, it's on, no problem. Okay, but what I'm going to do is sort of in between there, I'm going to put a transistor. Okay, and so I'll put the transistor sort of over here just to um, make it a little bit easier to see. And then I'm going to go, well, actually, you know what? Let me scoot all this stuff over just so it's a little easier to see it. Okay, so I'm going to go, so I want this here and a resistor here and this to ground. Okay, and then just to make sure that I've got it wired correctly, what I'm going to do is, oh, I need one more. I need this guy. Just to make sure that I haven't messed this up, I'm going to short it to the positive side just to make sure that the light turns on so that I have sort of stuff wired up correctly. So if I put this here and then just sort of touch to the positive lead, it turns on. Okay, so that means I've got it wired correctly. All right, now, so current will flow through the LED only if it flows through the transistor. Oh, and I'm sorry, you guys can't see what I was doing. Okay, so yeah, so I've got the green wire here goes from my 3.3 volts into the base of the transistor, then coming out of the emitter, I've got the black wire that goes over to the LED. And then right now, I don't have anything connected to the base of the transistor. Okay, so the transistor has 3 pins on it. And how do I know which one's which? Well, other than looking it up in the data sheet, um, the base is usually in the middle, and it's a little hard to see, but if I look at this thing from sort of the top down, you see how there's sort of a rounded back and a flat front. The flat front is what you look at, and then that tells you sort of the orientation of it. Or you just look it up in the data sheet. Okay, so that's what tells me what's what on this. And like I said, usually the base is in the middle, which is the one that we really want to do something with. Okay, so uh, if I apply too much power to the base, this thing will work in kind of weird ways. I'll sort of be overloading it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pretty big honking resistor in front of it. I'm going to put a 10 kilo ohm resistor, right? So 10,000 ohms compared to, say, 330, which is what I'm using for the LEDs. Okay, so real low power, little dab will do it, so to speak. Okay, and then, so I'll put that there. And then now what I'm going to do is if I apply power to it, then it's a little hard to see, then the light will turn on, right? And if I don't, the light will not turn on. Okay, so does that kind of make sense? Right, so all of that is controlled by whether or not I'm applying a voltage to the transistor or not. Okay, now, what I was just demoing right there is I just touched the wire to it, right, to give it power or not. But with the Arduino, what's really cool about that, about these, is I could actually program it. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug, um, I'm going to plug this into a pin that's on the Arduino, okay? So rather than going straight to power, I'm going to go to one of these programmable pins, and then what do you notice about the LED? Okay, it's turning off and on in some sort of predictable pattern, okay? Um, the reason it's turning on and off in a predictable pattern is that the Arduino, one of the things that's really cool about it is if you upload a program to it, you power it off. When you power it back on, it remembers that program and starts executing it. Okay, so this particular board, the guys in the class last semester, we wired up some circuits and we were telling through a program the Arduino to turn pin 2 on and off in some sort of predictable way. Now, for we actually were doing that with multiple pins, which we'll get to sort of what happens when you start to put multiple transistors together later. But yeah, so we were telling it to turn on in a certain pattern, and the program that happens to be stored on the machine is, or on the Arduino just powers right up the second you turn it on, okay? And so what's happening is that anytime pin 2, in this case, is turned on, that applies a voltage to the transistor, the light turns on, and if I don't apply voltage to it, it doesn't turn on, so it's off, right? And there we go. Okay, so that's sort of transistor function 101. Question, preguntas, Fragen. No? Just kind of magic? A little bit, yeah. Well, the physics of it is magic, right? And um, this is yet another unfortunate consequence of Corona because this little bucket with all this stuff in it. Well, I've got like 8 of them, and so last semester before the Rona, it'd be like, go check it out from the library, wire it up yourself. But alas, we can't do that. Okay. So, right, so that's sort of basically how a transistor is going to function. And what we want to sort of start to talk about is, all right, great, one transistor, who cares? What happens when I start putting multiple of these things together? Then what happens? Okay, so I could wire all this up, but it starts to get kind of messy quickly. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to show you in a simulator how this is going to look, and I'll put a copy of this simulator up on Canvas so you guys can get to it. All right, so I want to do full screen. Okay, so let me make sure that Twitch is correctly getting everything. Okay, good. All right, so this is a program called Logisim, and it's sort of going to sweep a few of the details under the rug in terms of like, so when I make a simulated circuit in here, I'm not actually going to worry about putting in the resistors, and it's just simulating, right? So it's not 100% accurate, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pin, and then I'm going to get a transistor, okay, which the symbol's slightly different here. I'm going to create another pin, and then I'm going to create an output, which for the purposes of the output, I'll just use a light. Okay, so this is sort of a schematic of what we had a minute ago. So I'll connect him to here, okay, and then him to here. Okay, then if I turn on the power, oh, that's why, it's the other kind. I need this one to be an N-type. There we go. Okay, so if I turn the power on to the circuit, okay, by turning that little pin on, current is not flowing through the transistor, okay? And the reason is I haven't applied a current to the base. So if I do that by turning on the other pin, then my light lights up, okay? So this is essentially the circuit that we've got for the green LED over here, right? So the green LED turns on only when both the circuit has actually got power and I turn the current to pin 2 on, okay? And the Arduino is just turning basically this input on and off every, half second or whatever it is. Okay, great. So that's a single transistor. And you remember I mentioned a second ago that if I change this to a P-type, then it's the other way, right? So an NPN is a default off, a PNP is a default on, right? So I'm applying current to turn it off, and if I stop applying that current, it turns on. Okay, so it's sort of backwards operation. Most of the time, though, like I said, we'll use the NPN type, but okay, so great. Got a single transistor, nothing fancy. All right, so let's doctor this up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put another one right there. And then I want both of them to be N types. And I'm going to connect one to the other. I'm going to put a pin here. I'm going to connect this pin to the base. And then I'm going to connect all of that to my little LED. Okay, so I've got two different pins, one controlling each transistor. And if I were to wire this up on the Arduino, I'd have to use another one of the output pins, so like 3 or 4 or whatever, right? And I could turn them on and off independently of each other. And that's actually the program that's running on the Arduino, is that it's turning on pins 2 and 3 in all 4 possible combinations, both on, both off, and one on, one off in both possible configurations. Okay, so under what circumstances will the light turn on here? Okay, so yeah, think about it. How is power going to make it all the way through both transistors to get to the LED? Well, the only way that would happen would be if both transistors are on, right? Now, under what circumstances are both transistors on? Exactly, when the inputs are on to both of them. Okay, so what we have just constructed there is what's called an AND gate. If you have two inputs, namely the two bases, the output is on only when both inputs are on. Okay, and there's a symbol for that. So this structure that we've constructed uh, can also be represented like that. Okay, so that little symbol, it's sort of a square back with a round front. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but you see there's two little dots on the back and one little dot on the front. Okay, the dots on the back are the inputs, and the dot on the front is the outputs. Okay, and uh, those two things do exactly the same thing. Okay, so if I were to wire, let me actually do this. I'm going to move this dude up here. I'm going to put another LED just to keep things from getting cluttered. And then I'll take my two inputs and I'll put one there and the other, oops, here. And then I'll connect this to the light. Okay, and now when I start to mess with the pins, right, the two things are going to do exactly the same. So this symbol is sort of shorthand for those two transistors that I've put in series. Okay, series means that they're connected one after the other in line. Okay, great. How else could I have wired these things? Well, in lots of ways, right? I could also do it. So let me just make a whole new thing. Okay, so let me do power, two inputs like so, and let me get two more of these transistors and make sure they're both N-type. All right, so I'll copy this dude and paste. Okay, so this time I'm going to wire it a little different. Okay, so power to the whole circuit. The base is connected to the inputs, and I want to have an LED over here. All right, but this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect like that. Okay, so now under what circumstances will power flow through the LED? I should mention, by the way, that wires are only touching when there's this little dot, right? So right there where I've got what looks like a green one crossing a blue one, they just cross each other. They're not actually connected. If they were, there'd be a dot right there so you can tell. Okay, so in this case, when will power flow through to the LED? Uh, okay, it'll be either or, possibly including both. Okay, so if I turn on either one of, oh yeah, the circuit needs power. Okay, so if I turn on that one, it turns on. If I turn on that one, it turns on. And if I turn on both, well, it's still on. Okay, so under either circumstances, this thing is on. Okay, this is what we call an OR gate because the output is on when either inputs are on. Now, there's one distinction, and we'll continue with this on Wednesday. Um, what happens if they're both on in the OR gate? So here, is that okay? Well, okay, maybe, but it still is on, right? It works. Okay. The reason I bring that up, and we'll quit, is what does the word "or" mean in English? Okay, but we use the word "or" in two different ways, right? So if I were back home and my mom says, would you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream for dessert? And I said, like both. What's my mom probably going to do? She's probably going to backhand me and I won't get anything. Okay, now, not really, I'm being facetious here, right? But sometimes when we use the word or, the assumption is that both of them is not a choice. Other times when we use the word or, the assumption is that, well, yeah, it's perfectly possible for both to be a choice, right? So compare that to Shakespeare, right? To be or not to be, well, you can't be both. All right, so we'll talk more about that later. So this little program is called Logisim, and I'll post a download for it on Canvas so you guys can tinker around. All right, so we'll quit the stream, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.